Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. I was 300 miles from my own front porch when the waitress refilling my coffee turned out to be my daughter-in-law, the one my son buried in an empty casket 11 months ago. She was 7 months pregnant. Her hands shook so hard the pot slipped and shattered on the tile. She grabbed my wrist and whispered 4 words that turned my blood cold. "Don't tell him. Please." I was 68 years old, and for 11 months I had been mourning beside the man who tried to drown her. So I did the only thing a father who built an empire in silence knows how to do. I stayed still and listened. The diner sat 12 miles outside Ogallala, the kind of low roadside place cattlemen filled up during auction week because the coffee was strong and the pie was cheap. I'd spent the morning walking a section of grazing land for a client ahead of the fall sale, the last real work I still took on since retiring from the county assessor's office. I told myself I'd earned a hot meal before the long drive home. I slid into a vinyl booth by the window, ordered black coffee and the pot roast special, and opened the notebook I still carried everywhere out of habit, the one with the parcel numbers and soil grades written in my own private shorthand. The place was half full, mostly ranch hands still in their auction day boots, mud-dried gray on the heels. A radio behind the counter played something with a steel guitar in it, turned low enough that nobody had to listen if they didn't want to. I liked places like this. 40 years of walking other men's land had taught me that a diner tells you more about a county than its courthouse does. Who's flush? Who's hurting? Who still tips in cash because the bank makes them nervous? I heard her before I saw her. A voice asking if I wanted cream flat, and tired, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had been on her feet since 5 in the morning. I didn't look up right away. I was marking a fence line in the margin of my notebook, the habit of 30 years in county work. Write it down before you lose the thought. When I finally raised my head to answer, the pen stopped moving in my hand, and it did not move again for a long time. The pink uniform was 2 sizes too tight, across a belly she hadn't had the last time I saw her. Her hair was different, darker cut, shorter than she'd ever worn it. But the jaw was hers, the eyes were hers. I would have known that face in a courtroom full of strangers, in a photograph left out in the rain, in a crowd 100 deep. It was Hannah. My son had stood over an empty casket 11 months ago and wept until 2 deputies had to walk him to his truck. I had held his shoulder at that graveside service. I had eaten dinner across from him 3 nights a week since watching him stare at nothing, telling myself grief did that to a man. I had believed every second of it. I am a man who spent his career reading discrepancies in official records for a living, and it had never once occurred to me that the discrepancy might be sitting across my own dinner table. The coffee pot slipped from her hand. It hit the tile and burst into 100 pieces, scalding liquid splashing across my boots and the base of the booth. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. A man behind the counter, the manager, judging by his apron and his temper, barked her name and told her to get a mop before she cost him a whole pot of coffee. Hannah didn't look at him. She didn't look at the mess at her feet. She looked at me the way a person looks at a ghost they weren't ready to see, and for one terrible second neither of us moved. Then she was around the counter and beside my booth, gripping my wrist with a strength I didn't expect from someone that far along in a pregnancy. Her fingers dug into the bone. Her whole body trembled, but her voice, when it finally came, was barely a breath. "Don't tell him, please." I opened my mouth to ask her 100 questions at once. How, why, where? Had she been for 11 months? Whose child she was carrying? And none of the words made it out before she was already pulling me up out of the booth, glancing over her shoulder at the manager, at the other diners at the window facing the highway, as if she expected my son's truck to come rolling into the gravel lot at any moment. "Not here," she said, her grip tightening. "Come with me. Now." I left a 20 on the table for a meal I never touched and let my daughter-in-law, a woman I had buried, a woman I had mourned, A woman my own son had sworn was lost to grief in open water pulled me past the counter, past the swinging kitchen doors, into whatever was waiting for me on the other side. The alley behind the diner smelled of grease trap runoff and cold gravel. Hannah didn't stop walking until we were past the dumpsters, out of sight of the kitchen window, her back against the brick wall, like she needed something solid behind her to keep standing. The autumn wind cut through my coat. It cut through her thin uniform worse. Hannah. I kept my voice low, the way I would with a spooked animal. Tell me what happened to you. She didn't answer right away. She was watching the mouth of the alley, the strip of highway visible past the dumpsters, like she expected headlights to swing in at any second. When she finally looked at me, there was nothing left of the soft, careful woman who used to sit across my kitchen table asking about soil moisture and grazing rotations. This was someone who had learned to survive. You buried an empty casket, she said, because there was nothing left to put in it. That's what he told everyone. Silo fire, grain dust, a spark from bad wiring, tragic accident, nobody's fault. Her mouth twisted around the word fault, like it burned going out. He locked the access hatch from the outside, Jedediah. I heard the bolt slide before I ever smelled smoke. I felt something go cold and still in my chest. The particular stillness of a man doing math he doesn't want to finish. Kaysen locked you in. She pulled back the sleeve of her uniform without another word. The burn ran from her wrist halfway up her forearm, the skin puckered and shiny in a pattern no accidental fire ever left. I had spent 30 years reading physical evidence for the county. Fire damage, structural failure, the difference between what happened and what a claim said happened. I knew what I was looking at. That's an accelerant burn, I said, not grain dust. I know what it is. I lived through it. Her voice cracked on the last word, then hardened back into place like she'd practiced holding it steady. There's an old auger tunnel under the north bin from when your own father ran cattle feed through it. Nobody's used it in 20 years. I only knew about it because I'd been out there treating a heifer with bloat the week before, and the tenant walked me past the access panel. When the smoke started, I crawled for it in the dark. I didn't think. I just moved. Why? I said. Why would my son do this to you? Hannah laughed short and bitter a sound with no humor left in it at all. Because I found the numbers, Jedediah. I've been doing books for the co-op on the side for 3 years, audits, compliance work, nothing glamorous. 2 months before the fire, Casson asked me to look over his fund's quarterly filings as a favor, said his regular accountant was out sick. I found withdrawals that didn't match deposits. Investor payouts coming from newer investor money instead of actual returns. I know what that looks like. I told him he needed to report it himself before the federal audit found it for him. And instead, he tried to kill you. He tried to kill the numbers I was carrying in my head, and it turned out I was attached to them. She pressed her palm flat against her belly, an unconscious gesture protective. The trust my grandmother left me, the land parcel that reverts to the surviving spouse if I die without an heir, that was supposed to be his safety net if the fund collapsed before he could cover the hole. Losing me solved 2 problems for him at once. The audit witness and the money. I made her walk me through it again slower, the appraiser in me needing the sequence to hold together before I'd let myself believe it. The fund had taken on new investors every quarter, she said, mostly families she and Kaysen had grown up around, men who trusted the Kramer name because it had meant something honest for 2 generations. The quarterly statements looked clean because Kaysen had been quietly plugging holes with each new round of deposits, a pattern she recognized instantly because she'd flagged the identical structure in a feed supply cooperative 2 counties over, 3 years back, before that operation folded and half a dozen families lost their retirement. She hadn't wanted to believe her own husband was running the same play. She'd given him 2 weeks to come clean before she said anything to anyone else. He hadn't needed 2 weeks. He'd needed 11 days and a grain bin and a locked hatch. I stood in that alley and felt the last 15 years of careful, quiet distance from my son collapse into something I couldn't name yet. I had spent so long believing my silence protected people. I was beginning to understand how much it had cost. "Where have you been?" I asked. 11 months, Hannah. Where? Moving. A shelter outside Broken Bow for the first 6 weeks. A cousin's trailer in Kansas after that. I picked up shifts here under a different name because it's far enough off the interstate that nobody from home ever stops. She wrapped her arms around herself, and for the first time since she'd pulled me into the alley, her composure slipped enough to show the exhaustion underneath it. "I have 3 months left before this baby comes, and I have $400, and I am so tired of being careful." I thought about the drive home ahead of me. The 4 hours of empty highway, my son's face waiting at the end of it, wearing the expression of a man who believed his grief had made him untouchable. I thought about the notebook in my coat pocket. 30 years of parcel numbers and soil grades, the private shorthand I'd built a whole quiet second life around. "You're not going back to being careful alone," I said. "Not anymore." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the spare key to my truck, the one I kept on a separate ring for exactly this kind of emergency, though I had never once imagined the emergency would look like this. I pressed it into Hannah's palm and closed her fingers around it before she could protest. "There's a motel off Highway 26 outside Bridgeport, 40 minutes west of here. The Sundowner. Pay cash register under any name but your own and don't call the front desk for anything. I'll find you tomorrow." I kept my voice low and even the same tone I used to talk skittish cattle away from a downed fence line. "Do you have enough gas to get there?" She nodded, still staring at the key, like she couldn't quite believe I'd handed it over that easily. "Jedediah, if he finds out you know it." "He won't." I said it with more certainty than I felt. "Go, now, before he starts wondering why I'm late." She didn't argue further. She slipped out through the alley's far end toward the gravel lot where the staff parked, and I watched her go until the dark folded around her, one hand pressed low against her belly, the other closed tight around my key. Then I walked back inside, paid for a meal I never touched, and drove east into a night that felt considerably colder than it had 4 hours earlier. The drive gave me time to build the man I needed to be by the time I reached the house. I have spent a career reading other people's records for a living. Reading them, not writing my own face into a lie, but grief I decided somewhere around mile marker 40 was mostly a posture. Slower steps, a softer voice, eyes that didn't quite focus on anything in the room. I rehearsed it in the rearview mirror at every stoplight between there and home, the way another man might rehearse a speech. I turned into the long gravel drive a little after 10, and my headlights swept across the front lawn before I'd even cut the engine, catching on something scattered and wrong in the grass. I parked and got out slowly, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. My tools, my drafting instruments and appraisal equipment, 30-some years of careful county work dumped across the wet grass like yard waste waiting on trash day. A brass compass my own father had given me when I passed my first licensing exam lay half buried near the porch steps, its glass face cracked. I knelt and picked it up, wiped the mud off with my thumb, and felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Kaysen was on the porch. He had a glass of something amber in one hand, the kind of drink a man pours himself when he wants to feel like he's already won an argument nobody's had yet. He didn't come down to help. He didn't apologize. He watched me gather my father's compass off the lawn, the way a man watches weather roll in from a safe distance, mildly curious, entirely unbothered. "You need to clear the master bedroom out tonight," he said before I'd said a word to him. "Move your things down to the utility room off the mudroom. Celeste's moving in this weekend and she'll want the closet space." I straightened up slowly, cradling the broken compass in one hand, and made myself ask the question a confused old man would ask instead of the one I actually wanted answered. "Who's Celeste?" "Someone I've been seeing." He said it easily, like the words cost him nothing, like his wife's absence hadn't bought him the freedom to say them. "She's helping me finalize some of Hannah's paperwork, insurance, the estate, that kind of thing. It's been a lot to handle alone, Dad." I heard the word insurance and felt the whole shape of what Hannah had told me in that alley snap into sharper focus. He wasn't grieving. He was closing a file. And he needed me small and slow and easy to move past while he did it. "That's fast." I said, letting a little tremor into it, an old man's confusion dressed up as concern. 11 months, son. Folks will talk. Let them. He took another sip, unhurried, and looked out at the dark tree line like the whole conversation bored him. I've spent 11 months being pitied in this county. I'd rather be envied for a while. He glanced back at me, and for one unguarded second, something colder than grief moved behind his eyes. Something I hadn't let myself see in him before that night. You're not going to make this difficult, are you? It wasn't really a question. I understood that even before he finished asking it. I gathered the rest of my scattered tools into my arms without arguing, letting my shoulders round the way a beaten man's shoulders round, letting my knees stiffen on the porch steps for his benefit. I did not look at him again. I carried what was left of 30 years of careful work through the side door and down the narrow hall toward the utility room, past the humming water heater and the shelf of paint cans, and set the broken compass on top of an overturned crate that would apparently be serving as my nightstand. The room smelled of mildew and old cardboard. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. I sat down on the edge of a cot that had clearly been dragged up from the barn, and for the first time all evening, alone with the door shut, I let my face stop performing anything at all. Somewhere upstairs, my son was pouring himself another drink, congratulating himself on how easily his father had folded. He had no idea I had spent the whole drive home deciding exactly how patient I was willing to be. Sleep wasn't coming, so I made myself useful instead. I sat on the edge of the cot and started sorting through the pile they'd dumped in with my tools, a milk crate of old barn ledgers, a tangle of extension cords, a canvas coat I didn't recognize, wadded up at the bottom, like nobody had wanted to deal with it properly. Someone had cleared out a storage closet in a hurry and let my equipment take the overflow along with it. I picked up the coat mostly out of habit, the same instinct that had me straightening county files for 30 years, even when nobody was going to check my work. It was heavier canvas than anything I owned, a work jacket, but not a farmer's jacket, no grain dust worked into the seams, no manure on the cuffs. Office wear pretending to be workwear. I turned it over once and something crinkled in the inside pocket. I pulled out a folded sheet of paper, creased soft from being carried around and forgotten. A receipt or something close to it. A quarterly statement head, or the kind of document a man tucks away and means to file and never does. The letterhead read, Prairie Crest Growth Partners, LLC, a name I had never once come across in 30 years of reading every agricultural filing that crossed a county desk in this part of the state. Below it, a single account summary line, a deposit confirmation for $41,000, dated 6 weeks earlier, no investor name printed anywhere on the page except an account number. I sat with that scrap of paper longer than I probably should have, turning it in my hands the way I used to turn over a disputed parcel survey, looking for the seam where the story didn't hold together. $41,000 was not pocket change, even for a man who drove the truck Cason drove. And Prairie Crest Growth Partners wasn't listed with the state, wasn't a name attached to any office building I'd ever appraised, wasn't anything I could place. Whatever was, it belonged in the same drawer as everything else about my son that had stopped making sense somewhere around 11 months ago. I folded the paper back along its original crease and tucked it inside my own coat, the one still hanging on a nail by the door, someplace Cason would never think to look, because he'd never once cared what his father owned. Then I stood up, my knees protesting the cot and the cold, both, and reached for the jacket again, meaning to hang it on the exposed pipe running along the ceiling, so it would stop taking up space on the floor. My hand brushed the plastic housing of the smoke detector bolted just beside the pipe, and I stopped. There was a light inside it, small, recessed, easy to miss, unless your hand happened to graze the casing in the dark the way mine just had. Not the steady green glow of a working detector, a thin red pulse, on, off, with a rhythm too even to be anything but deliberate. I had spent enough years walking commercial properties for insurance assessments to know exactly what I was looking at. I'd specified units like it myself back when a client wanted eyes on a warehouse after hours. I kept my hand still against the wall for a long moment, the way you'd hold still if you realized a half-second too late that you were standing in a bull's line of sight. Then I made myself move again, slow and unremarkable, hanging the strange canvas jacket exactly where I'd meant to hang it, giving the little red light nothing to report but an old man doing what old men do at midnight. I understood the room differently once I'd seen it. The cot in the corner, the bare bulb, the narrow window painted shut years ago. It wasn't simply where my son had decided to store an inconvenient father. It was a place designed to be watched, and I had walked into it without once suspecting I might need to behave as though someone were. I turned my back to the detector and sat down again on the edge of the cot, folding my hands in my lap the way a tired old man's hands fold, and let my face go slack and vacant for whatever lens was catching it. Inside my chest, nothing about me was slack at all. I was doing arithmetic. A hidden camera meant Kaysen didn't trust silence. It meant he suspected, on some animal level, that the compliance I'd shown him on the porch was a performance, even if he couldn't yet say why. It meant I would need a second phone, one he'd never think to search for, and a place in this room the little red eye couldn't reach. I glanced toward the far corner, where a rusted furnace unit sat crowded against the wall, throwing a wedge of shadow the camera's angle couldn't touch. I filed that detail away the same careful way I'd have logged a structural defect on an inspection report, precise, unemotional, ready to use. I thought about the burner phones sold at the truck stop off the interstate, cash only, no name required, and about how many miles it was to the next town over where nobody would recognize my truck parked outside one. I thought about Matthias Hearst's private line memorized decades ago and never once written down, and how strange it felt to be grateful in a room this cold for the habit of a man who trusted nothing to paper he couldn't burn. My son wanted a prisoner sleeping quietly in his basement. He was going to get one exactly as advertised on camera and on schedule, and nothing at all like the truth. It took me 2 days to get into town without raising a question I didn't want asked. I told Kaysen I needed my blood pressure medication refilled, which was true enough, and drove myself to the pharmacy in Ogallala, with my hands steady on the wheel the whole way. Steadier than they'd been in a week. I sat in the parking lot afterward, longer than I needed to, watching the ordinary traffic of an ordinary Tuesday move past the windshield. Farmers and their wives going about errands that had nothing to do with hidden cameras or locked silo hatches, and felt for a moment like a man watching his own life from the wrong side of a pane of glass. On the walk back to my truck, I stopped at the travel plaza off the interstate and bought a prepaid phone with cash from a rack near the register. The kind of thing truckers and men having affairs bought without anybody blinking. I paid for it alongside a bag of peanuts and a road atlas, so the clerk would remember the atlas if she remembered anything at all. I kept the phone in my left boot for 2 nights before I found the nerve to use it. On the 3rd night, once the house had gone quiet enough that I trusted the quiet, I eased myself off the cot and crossed to the far corner of the room, where the rusted furnace unit threw its wedge of shadow past whatever angle the camera and the smoke detector could reach. I sat down on an overturned crate and worked the phone loose from my boot and dialed the one number in this world I still trusted enough to call at midnight. Matthias Hearst answered on the first ring the way he always did, as though he never truly slept, only idled. "It's Jedediah," I said, keeping my voice below a whisper, close to the phone the way you talk into a stethoscope instead of a mouthpiece. "I need you to run a name for me. Prairie Crest Growth Partners, LLC. I found a deposit receipt for $41,000, no investor name on it, dated 6 weeks back." There was a pause on his end, the particular silence of a man already reaching for a legal pad. "Where did you find this?" "In a coat that isn't mine, dumped in with my things." I glanced toward the door, an old habit from 30 years of county meetings that ran long into things men didn't want written down. "Kaysen's got me in the basement, Matthias. There's a camera in the smoke detector. Whatever's happening in this house, he's watching to make sure nobody sees it happen." "I'll have something on Prairie Crest by tomorrow evening," Matthias said. In the meantime, I want you thinking hard about who else might have had access to that coat before it ended up in your things. A coat doesn't wander into a pile by accident, and neither does a fund with no public filing. I opened my mouth to answer him, to tell him about the alley behind the diner and the burn scar and the 11 months Hannah had spent hiding from a man everyone believed was drowning in grief for her. And that was the exact moment I heard the floorboard outside my door groan under weight it hadn't carried in years. I went still the way a man goes still when a rattlesnake shifts in tall grass 6 feet from his boot. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate stopping just shy of the door, the particular hesitation of someone standing close enough to listen, but not yet committed to knocking. My thumb found the disconnect button by feel and pressed it without a sound, cutting Matthias off mid-sentence. I slid the phone flat against my palm and eased myself down off the crates, folding my body into the shadow the furnace threw, making myself as small and unremarkable as 30 years of appraisal work had never once required me to be. The door didn't open. I counted my own pulse in the dark, 4 beats 6:10, waiting for the handle to turn for Kaysen's voice to demand to know who I was talking to at this hour. Instead, I heard him exhale close enough that I could tell it was him and not Celeste, by the particular weight of the breath, and then the floorboard groaned again as he shifted his weight and walked on back down the hall toward the stairs. I stayed folded into that shadow for a long while after the sound of him had faded entirely. Longer than the danger strictly required, because my hands had started shaking, and I needed them steady again before I trusted myself to move. When I finally did move, I didn't dial Matthias back, not that night. I understood with the particular clarity a near miss tends to provide that I had let myself get careless in the exact way a man in his 69th year of caution shouldn't. I worked the phone back into my boot and lay down on the cot fully dressed, staring up at the ceiling pipe where the strange canvas jacket still hung, and made myself a private set of rules before sleep finally took me. Never the same hour twice, never longer than 4 minutes on the line, always the furnace shadow, never the crate in the open. I thought of Hannah somewhere in a motel room off Highway 26, alone, with the same kind of arithmetic, and understood that carelessness now wasn't a risk I was taking only for myself. My son had built himself a house designed to watch an old man fail to notice he was being watched. I intended to make sure the only thing he ever caught on camera was exactly the frail, compliant nothing he expected to see. I waited 4 days before I called Matthias back, longer than I wanted to, but I promised myself no repeats of the mistake that nearly cost me everything the last time. I picked a Tuesday near 2 in the morning, the deadest hour a house like this ever produced, and eased myself into the furnace shadow with the phone already in my hand before I dialed, so there'd be no fumbling to explain if the floor groaned again. Prairie Crest Growth Partners isn't an investment fund, Matthias said without any greeting, the way he always dispensed with things that didn't matter to get faster to the things that did. It's a private lending operation, hard money, short term, the kind that doesn't advertise and doesn't file with the state because it doesn't need to. I made 3 calls to people who owe me favors before I found someone willing to say the name out loud. Lending to who? To your son. That receipt you found wasn't a deposit into an investment, it was an interest payment. Prairie Crest fronted Kaysen $480,000 11 weeks ago, and the $41,000 you found in that coat pocket was the second installment on the interest alone, not the principal. He let that number sit on the line for a moment before he continued. I don't know yet what he needed that money for, but I know men who lend at those terms don't send politely worded reminders when a payment's late. How does a man borrow $500,000 from people like that without anyone noticing? The same way he's been running everything else through paper that looks clean until somebody with a reason to look closely gets a hold of it. I heard him flipping pages on his end, the dry rustle of a legal pad. I cross-referenced the fund's public filings against county land records this afternoon. Kaysen's been quietly pledging parcels as informal collateral for over a year, nothing recorded, nothing that would show up in a standard title search, just handshake arrangements with men who don't need the county's permission to collect what they're owed. He's been playing a shell game with land he doesn't fully control, moving obligations around faster than anyone could audit them, right up until the day his own wife sat down with his numbers and did exactly that. I sat with my back against the cold brick, doing the arithmetic in my head the way I used to do it on a job site, load-bearing calculations, where a wrong figure meant a roof came down on somebody. $480,000, 11 weeks ago. I counted backward without needing to say it out loud. 11 weeks put the loan almost exactly at the same point on the calendar as the week Hannah disappeared into a burning grain bin. "There's more," Matthias said, and something in his voice shifted, careful in a way I'd rarely heard from him. I pulled the public notice board for the State Agricultural Investment Oversight Office. Funds managing client capital above a certain threshold get flagged for a compliance review on a rolling basis. Kaysen's fund is scheduled for review in 19 days. 19 days. I felt the whole shape of the last 11 months rearrange itself around that number, the way a survey rearranges itself once you find the one boundary marker that was never where the old map said it was. He needed the shortfall covered before anyone official looked at the books. I said more to myself than to Matthias, working it through out loud, because saying it slowly was the only way I trusted myself to believe it. He borrowed from men who don't forgive late payments to cover money he'd already lost to investors he promised returns he couldn't deliver. And Hannah found the gap before the state ever would. "That's my read as well," Matthias paused. "Jedediah, I want to say this plainly because I don't think plain is a luxury either of us has right now. Your son isn't drowning in one debt. He's drowning in two, and each one is currently his excuse for not paying the other. The state audit is bearing down on the fund. The lenders are bearing down on him personally. And the one asset that could have solved both problems at once, the insurance payout and the reversion of Hannah's land trust, required her not to exist anymore." "So he wasn't choosing between the money and getting caught," I said. "He thought he'd found a way to have both. He thought a body at the bottom of a burned grain bin doesn't ask questions during a compliance review. He was wrong on one count. He didn't account for the auger tunnel, and he didn't account for you walking into that diner on the one day in 11 months she happened to be working the counter." Matthias let that sit a moment. "Luck like that doesn't repeat itself twice, Jedediah. Whatever we build from here has to work the first time." I didn't answer him right away. Down the hall somewhere above me I could hear the house settling the way old houses do at that hour, timber contracting in the cold, and for a moment it sounded exactly like the floorboard outside my door 4 nights earlier, and my whole body went rigid before I remembered myself and made myself breathe. 19 days, I said finally. 19 days, Matthias agreed. "Whatever we're going to do, Jedediah, we're not doing it slowly anymore." I ended the call and sat in the dark a long while, after the phone cooling in my palm, listening to the ordinary creak of a house I no longer recognized as safe. I thought about the summer Kaysen turned 20, the way I'd quietly paid off a bookie in Kearney and never once mentioned it at the dinner table, certain that silence was a kindness and not a debt of its own coming due. I had spent 15 years believing that patience and silence were a kind of armor a man could build around the people he loved. Sitting in that shadow, doing the math on my own son's ruin, I understood for the first time how much that armor had already cost the people I'd meant to protect with it, and how little of it had ever actually protected him. The burner phone buzzed against my ankle a few minutes past 1 in the morning, and I knew before I even reached for it that nothing good arrived at that hour through a phone only one person on earth had the number to. "Something's wrong. Started bleeding. Contractions too close together. Driving myself to the clinic in Bridgeport. Can't wait for an ambulance to find me out here. Please come." I read it twice, standing in the dark, and every calculation I'd spent the last 2 weeks building, patience, silence, careful arithmetic, collapsed into a single fact that mattered more than any of it. I could not lose that child to my own caution. I moved fast and quiet, the two things a man my age isn't supposed to manage at the same time. I balled my spare coat and the flat pillow into a shape under the thin blanket on the cot, rough and unconvincing in daylight, but enough, I hoped, to read as a sleeping man to a lens fixed on a 15-degree angle in the dark. I eased the painted-shut window up an inch at a time, feeling the old seal crack along its seam, praying the sound wouldn't carry past the hum of the water heater beside it. Cold air poured in, smelling of frost and cut hay. I climbed through sideways, dropped the 4 feet to the flower bed below, and didn't look back at the house until I was already moving. I kept to the tree line skirting the equipment shed, where my father's old 3/4-ton work truck sat parked behind the grain cart. A rust-scarred relic Kaysen had never once bothered to ask about, because in his mind it belonged to a man too old and too irrelevant to matter. The engine turned over rough and loud in the silent yard, loud enough that I sat frozen for a full 10 seconds, waiting for a light to snap on in an upstairs window. None did. I backed out along the field road instead of the driveway, running without headlights, until I hit the county blacktop, and only then did I let myself breathe and press the accelerator down. The drive to Bridgeport took 40 minutes that felt like 4 hours. I called the clinic's after-hours line from the burner as I drove, gave a false name for myself and Hannah's real symptoms, and was told an obstetric nurse would be waiting. I thought about the calendar the whole way, the math I couldn't stop running, even now. 32 weeks, maybe 33. A full month early by any count, and every mile marker I passed felt like a wager against a clock I had no control over. Twice, I caught myself glancing in the rearview mirror for headlights that weren't there. Old instinct from the last 2 weeks refusing to switch off, even now, even with a truck Kaysen didn't know I owned carrying me somewhere he had no reason to look. The clinic was a low cinder block building on the edge of the county line, the kind of place built for calving emergencies and harvest injuries more than complicated deliveries, but it had lights on and a nurse already moving toward the door when my headlights swept the lot. I left the truck running crooked across 2 parking spaces and went in at a near run. They had Hannah in a narrow exam room, a single overhead light too bright for the hour, her face drained the color of the sheets under her. A young doctor who looked barely older than Kaysen stood at the foot of the bed, calling out instructions to a nurse threading an IV line into her arm. Hannah's hand found mine the second I reached the bedside and gripped it with a strength that startled me, her knuckles white, her whole body shaking with effort she refused to let turn into screaming. "You came," she said through gritted teeth, like she genuinely doubted it. "Of course I came." I held on and didn't let the tremor in my own voice show. "You're not doing this alone." The next 20 minutes blurred into a rhythm of monitors and instructions and Hannah's ragged breathing, the doctor calling for one more push, then another, the fetal heart monitor climbing into a register that made the nurse's face tighten before she smoothed it back into professional calm. Hannah bore down with a ferocity I recognized from the alley behind the diner. The same refusal to be beaten by something bigger than her that had gotten her out of a burning grain bin through a tunnel in the dark. She was not going to let a hospital bed succeed where fire and smoke had already failed. A thin, furious cry cut through the room, and the doctor lifted a small, impossibly small boy into the light, red-faced and screaming and entirely defiantly alive. Hannah's whole body sagged back against the pillows, her grip on my hand finally loosening, tears cutting clean lines down a face that hadn't allowed itself to cry in front of anyone in 11 months. I stood there and felt something in my own chest give way that I hadn't known was still holding tension, some last brace against the possibility that all of it, the alley, the burn scar, the tunnel in the dark, might still end in a loss I couldn't undo. The nurse wrapped the baby in a rough white blanket and set him against Hannah's chest, and I stood there, 68 years old, watching my grandson take his first unsteady breaths in a cinder block clinic 3 counties from the only home he'd ever legally belonged to. The doctor turned to me a moment later, a clipboard in his hands, asking without particular ceremony whether I was the father or the designated emergency contact for the birth registry. I looked at Hannah. She gave me the smallest nod, exhausted certain. I took the clipboard and the pen, and I did not correct his assumption. The clipboard felt heavier in my hands than its weight accounted for. State birth registry forms 3 carbon copies blanks for a father's name and a legal guardian's name sitting side by side on the page like the state itself understood that families didn't always arrive in tidy pairs. "Mr. Kramer," the doctor said, glancing at my county identification. "We just need someone to sign as the responsible party while Mom's still under observation. Given the circumstances, that's usually the father, but I understand that's complicated tonight." "It's complicated," Hannah said from the bed, her voice thin with exhaustion but steady enough to carry. She looked at me over the small bundle in her arms, and something passed between us that didn't need translating into words. "I want Jedediah listed as legal guardian, not just tonight, on the permanent record." The doctor blinked, recalibrated, without asking the question written plainly on his face, and slid a second form across the rolling tray. A formal guardianship designation, the kind of document that usually took a family court hearing and 6 weeks of paperwork to process, except that a hospital delivering an infant with an absent or unreachable father had emergency authority to grant temporary guardianship on the spot, pending court confirmation. I had read enough county filings over the decades to understand exactly what I was holding. It wasn't permanent, but it was fast, and it was legal, and it would exist in the state system the moment my signature dried, which was more protection than my grandson had possessed 30 seconds earlier. "Have you settled on a name?" the nurse asked, pen hovering over the space that would make it official. Hannah looked down at the small, furious face pressed against her chest, still slick and red and working itself toward a second cry. "Emmett," she said. "Emmett Rogers Kramer. Rogers was my grandmother's name, the one who left me the land in the first place." She glanced up at me. It felt right that he should carry a piece of the trust that's protecting him, even in his name. I nodded, unable to trust my voice with much more than that, and took the pen the nurse offered. I understood holding it exactly what I was about to do, and exactly what it would mean once it was done. The moment my signature dried on that page, Emmett Rogers Kramer would exist in the eyes of the state as a legal heir with a guardian who was not his father, which meant the reversion clause buried in Hannah's family trust, the clause that would have handed her land parcel to Kaysen as surviving spouse if she died without a living heir, was permanently and irreversibly closed. I had read enough trust language over the decades to know how rarely a single signature closed a door that completely, and how much most families paid a lawyer to achieve exactly this kind of finality after months of argument. Kaysen's entire calculation, the arithmetic that had driven him to lock a hatch and strike a match, collapsed the instant ink touched paper. He didn't know it yet. He wouldn't know it for weeks. But the foundation he'd murdered his wife to secure no longer existed, and it had stopped existing in a fluorescent-lit exam room at 4 in the morning, witnessed by a tired doctor who thought he was simply processing routine paperwork. I signed my name on the line marked Legal Guardian, pressing hard enough that the ink bled slightly into the fibers of the cheap paper, the way I'd learned decades ago to sign anything that mattered, deliberately, without hesitation. The kind of signature nobody could later claim was coerced or confused. I dated it, I initialed the 2 supplementary pages the nurse handed me, after acknowledgments and disclosures I barely registered, reading, because none of them carried the weight of the first page. The doctor took the clipboard back, glanced over the signatures with the mild satisfaction of a man closing out a long shift, and told us he'd file the paperwork with the county clerk's office first thing when it opened. Hannah's hand found mine again, weaker now than it had gripped me an hour earlier, but her eyes were sharp and clear despite the exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking me to wait, for not telling me we should think it over." There wasn't anything to think over. I looked down at Emmett at the impossibly small fingers curled against Hannah's hospital gown, and felt the full shape of what 15 years of careful, quiet patience had cost this family settle somewhere behind my ribs. Some decisions only get more dangerous the longer you sit with them. She studied my face for a moment, like she was hearing something underneath the sentence I hadn't quite said aloud. Then she let her head fall back against the pillow, finally allowing the adrenaline to drain out of her all at once, and closed her eyes. One hand still resting loosely against Emmett's back, as if even sleep couldn't fully convince her it was safe to let go. I sat in the vinyl chair beside her bed until the sky outside the narrow window turned the color of weak coffee, holding a sleeping grandson I had met less than 2 hours earlier, already calculating how many more hours I had before I needed to be back in that utility room folded into a shape my son would recognize as defeat. I had never moved faster on less certainty in my entire life. For the first time since I'd watched Kaysen stand over an empty casket 11 months ago, I did not regret a single second of it. I left the clinic a little after 6, kissed Emmett's forehead while he slept against Hannah's chest, and drove the old work truck back toward the house with the sun still low and orange on the horizon, telling myself I had enough daylight left to slip back through the window before anyone noticed the cot had been empty for hours. I never made it that far. I parked the truck in the same stand of trees I'd used to leave, cut the engine, and started across the field toward the equipment shed on foot. And that was when I heard it. Raised voices, carrying flat and hard across the cold morning air coming from inside the house itself. Not Kaysen's usual clipped irritation, something rougher. I dropped low along the fence line instead of crossing the open yard, working my way toward the side of the house where the living room windows faced the drive and looked in through a gap in the curtains Celeste hadn't gotten around to closing all the way. 2 men I'd never seen before stood in my living room. Big men, dressed cheap but deliberately unremarkable, the kind of men who understood that a nice suit drew more attention than an ordinary one. One of them had Kaysen's collar bunched in a fist thick as a fence post, holding him up on his toes against the wall beside the fireplace. The other was methodically clearing the mantel with the flat of his hand, letting framed photographs shatter across the hearthstone one at a time, unhurried like a man doing chores. I could hear enough through the old single-pane glass to understand the shape of it even without every word. A deadline. A number. My son's voice thin and pleading in a register I had never once heard from him in 37 years, promising the money would be there, promising an insurance payout was close, promising anything a man promises with someone else's hand closed around his windpipe. "Friday," the larger man said loud enough that I caught it clean through the glass. "Noon. $500,000 unmarked or we stop being reasonable about this." He let Kaysen drop. My son crumpled against the wall and slid to the floor amid the broken glass, gasping one hand at his throat, and for one disorienting second I felt something that might have been pity trying to surface before I remembered exactly what those same hands had done to Hannah in a burning grain bin 11 months earlier. The pity didn't survive the memory. The second man crouched beside Kaysen unhurried and said something too low for me to catch through the glass, though I saw Kaysen's whole body flinch at whatever it was. Then both men straightened, walked out through the splintered front door without so much as glancing at the wreckage they'd made of my living room, and got into a dark sedan idling at the end of the drive. I stayed flat against the cold ground until the sound of their engine faded completely down the county road. I gave it another 10 minutes before I moved circling back to the equipment shed, and then to the utility room window, easing it open the same careful inch-by-inch way I had 6 hours earlier climbing back through into a room that still smelled faintly of the pillow I'd shaped into my own outline under the blanket. I straightened the bedding, tucked the pillow back where it belonged, and only then let myself walk out through the house properly, shuffling, confused, an old man wandering toward the kitchen for his morning coffee, like he'd slept through whatever had happened in the next room. I found Kaysen still sitting on the living room floor when I came around the corner, surrounded by broken glass and the wreckage of framed photographs, Celeste's expensive vases in pieces, the good side table on its back, with one leg cracked clean off. He looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was 20 years old, and I'd found him with his mother's jewelry box open on his bed. "What happened here?" I asked, keeping my voice appropriately slow, appropriately baffled, letting my eyes wander over the destruction, like I couldn't quite make sense of it. He didn't answer right away. He pressed the back of his hand against his split lip and stared at the ruined hearth like he was doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. When he finally looked up at me, whatever mask he usually wore for my benefit had slipped entirely, and underneath it, I saw something raw and cornered that I recognized immediately because I had spent 30 years reading exactly that expression on men who'd overextended themselves on land they couldn't actually afford. The particular look of someone who has just realized the ground under him was never as solid as he'd built his whole life on top of it. "Nothing," he said. "Business dispute. It's handled." "It doesn't look handled." I bent slow and careful on my knees and began gathering shards of broken glass into my cupped palm. An old man doing the only useful thing an old man knows how to do in a crisis he isn't trusted to understand. "You're bleeding, son." He wiped his mouth again and said nothing further. And I understood, watching him stare at the ruined mantel with the particular stillness of a man calculating how many more days he had left before something worse than broken glass came through that door that Friday noon was no longer a date on a calendar. It was the exact moment the last of his careful lies were going to stop protecting anyone at all, including him. Kaysen found me in the kitchen an hour later, freshly showered, the split lip covered with a dab of concealer that didn't fool anyone who'd spent 30 years reading the difference between what a face showed and what a face was hiding. He set a thick leather folder down on the table, hard enough to rattle my coffee cup, and I understood before he said a single word that Friday's deadline had finally pushed him past whatever patience he'd been rationing out to me. "We need to talk about the estate," he said. "Practically, while there's still time to do it the easy way." I looked up at him with the vacant, mild confusion I'd been rehearsing for 2 weeks, the expression of a man who'd misplaced the thread of the conversation before it even started. "What estate, son?" "This one. The house. The land." His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "I've arranged for someone to come by this afternoon, a specialist, just to make sure everything's in order given your memory lately." "My memory's fine. You forgot Celeste's name twice last week." He said it flatly, and I understood he'd been keeping a private ledger of small failures I'd never actually committed, building a case out of nothing the way a man builds a case out of nothing when he needs the nothing to be enough. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Dad. I'm trying to protect what's left before things get complicated." Complicated was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. I let it pass because arguing too hard was its own kind of tell. And by early afternoon, a tall man in a gray suit walked through my splintered front door carrying a sleek tablet and an expression of professional condescending sympathy he'd clearly practiced in a mirror. "Dr. Moran," Kaysen said by way of introduction. "He specializes in geriatric evaluations. This won't take long." Dr. Eliel Moran did not offer to shake my hand. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, woke his tablet, and began asking questions in the particular loud, slow cadence people use on the very old or the very foreign, as though volume alone might improve my comprehension. Who was the current governor? What year it was? Could I count backward from 100 by sevens? I answered the first two correctly, cleanly, the way any competent man would. On the third, I let my eyes drift toward the window, hesitated over 93 the way a genuinely confused man might, and murmured something about misplacing my reading glasses that had nothing to do with mental arithmetic at all. Dr. Moran typed rapidly, nodding at Kaysen with a look of manufactured concern that told me exactly how much this consultation was actually costing. He moved on to questions with sharper edges after that. Did I often forget to turn off the stove? Had I wandered outside disoriented in recent weeks? Kaysen supplied answers to both before I could open my mouth, inventing an incident involving the porch light and my pajamas that had never once happened, and Dr. Moran accepted every fabricated word as clinical fact without asking for so much as a witness statement. He asked with a gentleness that felt more clinical than kind whether I sometimes struggled to recognize my own son. I let the question hang a beat too long before answering, no, watching Kaysen's face for any flicker of shame at hearing it asked at all, and finding none. I sat through the humiliation of it and let him build his flimsy diagnosis directly on top of the trap I'd already been quietly digging for weeks. When he finally turned the tablet around, The screen displayed a preliminary finding of moderate cognitive decline, dressed up in enough clinical language to look unimpeachable to anyone who didn't know better. He slid a thick stack of paper across the table alongside it, a durable power of attorney, financial and medical transferring authority over my affairs entirely to Kaysen. He tapped a silver pen against the signature line and told me in the tone reserved for children and the very frail that this would simply let my son handle the complicated parts so I could enjoy some peace of mind. Kaysen leaned over my shoulder close enough that I could smell the fear sweating out of him underneath his cologne. "Just sign it, Dad. I'll take care of everything." I reached for the pen and let my hand shake, not the practiced tremor I'd used on the porch 2 weeks earlier, but something looser, more convincing, the hand of a man who'd genuinely lost confidence in his own grip. I pressed the nib to the paper and dragged it across the signature line in a jagged, uncertain scrawl, nothing like the deliberate hand I'd used my entire career, letting the ink blot heavy at the end, the way a trembling hand actually blots. Kaysen snatched the papers off the table the instant the pen lifted, and something in his shoulders loosened for the first time since I'd found him bleeding on the living room floor that morning. He counted the pages once, twice, like a man checking a winning lottery ticket for a printing error. He thanked Dr. Moran and handed him a thick white envelope from the leather folder, cash by the weight and shape of it, and the doctor pocketed his fee and left without a backward glance at the man whose life he'd just signed away on paper that meant absolutely nothing. Kaysen looked down at me with something close to pity, the particular contempt a man reserves for an obstacle he believes he's finally cleared. "That utility room's too good for you now," he said. "I'll get you somewhere more comfortable once this settles." He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving toward the door, toward the bank, toward whatever he believed this signature had just unlocked for him. Utterly unaware that the account he was about to try to drain no longer answered to anyone's authority but a decade-old trap and a lawyer who never slept. I didn't witness what happened next with my own eyes. I pieced it together over the following days from Matthias's reports from bank records subpoenaed months later and eventually from Celeste's own signed statement. But I've set it down here exactly as it happened, because by the time I understood the full shape of it, I needed to know precisely how the trap had closed. Kaysen drove straight from the house to the First Platte Valley branch downtown, the power of attorney documents still warm from the printer, riding on the passenger seat beside him. He parked crooked across 2 spaces, the way a man parks when he's already spending money he doesn't have yet in his head, and walked in with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the hardest part is already behind you. He handed the teller my retirement account number and the newly signed authorization, requested an immediate transfer of the full balance to a routing number the lenders had provided him, and waited, drumming his fingers on the counter for the confirmation screen to populate. It never did. The teller frowned at her monitor, excused herself, and returned with a supervisor who informed him in the flat, apologetic tone reserved for news nobody wants to deliver twice that the account had been flagged and frozen under federal monitoring protocols and that any further inquiry would need to go through a compliance officer. "That's not possible," Kaysen said, loud enough that 2 other customers turned to look. "I have power of attorney. I have the paperwork right here." He slid the folder across the counter, as though volume and paper together could override whatever machinery had already made its decision. The supervisor didn't so much as glance at the documents. Federal flags, she told him, superseded any state-notarized authorization, and there was nothing a branch office in western Nebraska had the standing to unlock. Kaysen didn't understand in that moment that the account he'd just tried to breach had been sitting untouched and unremarkable for a decade specifically so that the day someone tried to breach it, an alarm would ring in an office he'd never once heard of. He argued. He demanded escalation. He was told politely and finally that the matter was out of the branch's hands, and he left the bank with nothing but a business card for a compliance line that would never call him back with good news. He went to Celeste that same afternoon, and whatever composure the bank had cost him, he rebuilt it entirely for her benefit. He found her in the spare room she'd been slowly filling with moving boxes, and he dropped to his knees in front of her chair, took her hands, and told her the fund was facing a liquidity crisis that would end everything he'd built if he couldn't produce capital within days. He didn't mention lenders or broken photographs. He told her only enough truth to make the lie land, and he asked her with tears that may or may not have been genuine to help him buy time. Celeste hesitated. She explained the mandatory waiting period built into the state's oversight process, the compliance review Kaysen's fund was scheduled for, the specific federal protections designed to prevent exactly the kind of shortcut he was asking her to take. He tightened his grip on her hands and reminded her of her clearance level, told her a hardship exemption filed under her authority could push the review back by weeks, framed the whole thing as a minor administrative kindness rather than what it actually was. She loved him, and love has a long history of being easier to weaponize than to argue with. She opened her state-issued laptop that evening and logged into the restricted federal database she'd sworn an oath to protect, and began entering the override codes that would manually delay Kaysen's compliance review under a fabricated hardship designation. Matthias caught it within the hour. He had embedded a digital tripwire into the Agricultural Investment Oversight System months earlier, back when his own audit of Kaysen's finances first turned up enough red flags to justify watching every door that might open. A yellow alert crossed his second monitor a few minutes past 9 that night, flagging an unauthorized administrative override tied to Celeste's personal login credentials. He didn't hesitate over what to do with it. He compiled the digital footprint of her intrusion, attached a detailed summary of her documented relationship with the fund's principal, and routed the entire package to the Internal Affairs Division of her own agency before the override had even finished processing. Celeste closed her laptop that night believing she'd bought her fiancé a few more weeks of breathing room. She had no idea she'd just triggered an internal federal investigation with her own name at the center of it, or that the very system she'd trusted to protect her career for 11 years had already begun quietly building a case against her. I learned all of this from Matthias 2 nights later, sitting in my usual corner behind the furnace. And I remember feeling something close to grief on Celeste's behalf, even as the rest of the trap tightened exactly as intended. She had spent 11 years building a career on the careful, unglamorous work of protecting other people's money. And she was about to lose all of it for a man who had never once in the entire time I'd watched them together asked what protecting something actually cost. Kaysen had spent his entire life finding people willing to absorb the cost of his mistakes. He was about to run out of people willing to do it for free. 3 days passed before Kaysen tried his next move. 3 days in which I watched him grow thinner and more erratic, checking his phone every few minutes, like a man waiting on a verdict he already suspected would go against him. He never mentioned the bank. He never mentioned Celeste. Though I noticed she'd stopped moving boxes into the master bedroom sometime around Thursday, and the U-Haul she'd rented sat unexplained and half unpacked in the driveway. Her car was gone by Wednesday night and hadn't returned. I asked no questions. An old man confused about his own memory doesn't get to ask pointed questions about anyone else's business, though I suspected from what Matthias had already told me about her override at the oversight office that whatever conversation had sent her car down that driveway was not one Kaysen had won. On Friday morning, a car I didn't recognize pulled up the drive a little after 9. A clean sedan, county plates. A man in a collared shirt stepping out, with a leather portfolio and a laser measuring device tucked under one arm. Kaysen met him on the porch with the particular warmth he reserved for people he needed something from. All handshake and easy smile, no trace of the man who'd been sweating through his shirt at the bank 3 days earlier. "Jeffrey Bryant," Kaysen said, walking him toward the front door, loud enough for me to hear from where I sat pretending to read the newspaper in the front room. "He handles rapid appraisals for the county. We're going to get this place properly valued so I can move forward on the loan." I kept my eyes on the newspaper and let the words wash past me without reacting, though the word loan told me exactly what kind of desperate arithmetic Kaysen had landed on after 2 doors had already slammed shut on him that week. If the bank wouldn't move my money, and Celeste's shortcut had gone nowhere he'd mentioned, Land was the only asset left. He believed he still controlled the one thing in his life he'd never once thought to question, because, as far as he knew, it had been sitting under his name since before he could walk. Bryant walked the property with a practiced, unhurried thoroughness, tapping measurements into a tablet, photographing the original crown molding in the front hall, and the Italian marble Cason's mother had insisted on 20 years earlier, nodding along politely while Cason narrated the house's value like a man reciting a resume he'd memorized for a job interview. He was certain he'd already won. He was certain he'd already won. He talked about the acreage, the water rights, the outbuildings, inflating each figure just slightly, the way a man does when he's stopped being able to tell the difference between what a thing is worth and what he needs it to be worth. Cason mentioned more than once that his father's health had declined recently, that the power of attorney was already processed and verified, that the title transfer would be a simple administrative formality once the appraisal came back favorable. He said all of it standing 3 feet from me, without once lowering his voice, the way a man speaks about furniture he doesn't expect to answer back. I sat with my newspaper and said nothing. And inside my chest something had gone very quiet and very still. The particular stillness of a structure holding weight it was never designed to hold, right before the first crack shows. Bryant finished his walkthrough of the main rooms and settled at the dining table, pulling a slim laptop from his portfolio and connecting to the county's secure title database, the same system I had used 10,000 times over 30 years to verify exactly what he was about to verify now. He explained, without much interest, that a loan of this size required immediate confirmation of clear title through the state registry before any lender would move forward. Cason poured himself a glass of scotch from the sideboard and told him to take his time, magnanimous, utterly certain the search would return exactly what he expected it to return. I watched Bryant type the property's parcel address into the search field and hit enter. I watched the screen refresh with the official municipal records the way it always did, clean and immediate and impossible to argue with. I watched him lean closer to the monitor, a small frown creasing his forehead, and scroll down the page slowly. The particular slow scroll of a man rereading something because the first reading must have been a mistake. The dining room had gone quiet enough that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hall marking the seconds, and I found myself holding my newspaper without turning a page, my whole body arranged in stillness while something inside me leaned forward. He cleared the search bar and typed the address again more carefully, this time, hitting each key like he suspected his own fingers of the error. The screen refreshed. The result was identical. Bryant pushed his chair back an inch from the table and looked up first at his own laptop, then across the room at Cason, with the particular expression of a man who has just discovered a discrepancy he doesn't yet know how to phrase politely. "There's an irregularity with the loan application," he said. Cason lowered his glass slowly, the easy confidence still holding. For one more second, one more breath before whatever was written on that screen had the chance to reach him. "What irregularity?" he said. "The parcel isn't titled to you," Bryant said, turning the laptop screen so it faced across the table. "It's held by an entity called Kramer Land Holdings, LLC. Registered agent listed is an attorney's office downtown. There's no individual ownership on record at all. Not yours, not your father's, nobody's. Just the trust." Cason set his scotch down harder than he meant to, the crystal cracking against the sideboard's marble top. "That's a clerical error. My father's owned this land for 30 years. I've lived in this house my whole life." "The tax record shows a transfer of the deed exactly 15 years ago," Bryant said, unmoved, the way a man is unmoved when he's simply reading numbers off a screen and has no stake in whatever those numbers do to the person hearing them. "Clean transfer, properly filed. No liens, no disputes on record. Whoever set this up did it carefully." 15 years. I watched the number land on Cason the way a physical blow lands, watched something in his face travel backward through a decade and a half of memory before it found the exact place it needed to stop. I knew the instant he found it because I had lived inside that same memory for 15 years myself, replaying it on nights I couldn't sleep. 15 years ago was the summer he turned 20. 15 years ago was the week I'd walked into his mother's room and found her jewelry box open and half emptied, the week I'd quietly tracked down the pawnbroker in Kearney who'd bought a dead woman's wedding rings off her own son the week I'd paid to get them back, and never once raised my voice about it, certain that silence was mercy and not the first brick in a wall neither of us had noticed being built. I remembered driving home from that pawn shop with the rings wrapped in a handkerchief in my coat pocket, rehearsing a dozen different ways to confront him, and choosing in the end to say nothing at all. I had told myself that summer that a boy who'd lost his mother deserved one unrecorded mistake. I understood now, watching him standing frozen beside a dining table 15 years later, that a single unrecorded mistake had simply taught him the shape of every mistake that followed. Kaysen's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. He looked from Bryant to me, and something in his expression shifted from confusion into a dawning, horrified recognition, the particular look of a man realizing the ground he's been standing on for years was never load-bearing at all. "You did this," he said, his voice dropping into something quieter and far more dangerous than his usual bluster. "You moved the deed." I set my newspaper down on the arm of the chair slowly, deliberately, and let the last of the confused old man I'd been performing for 2 weeks fall away entirely. There was no longer any reason to hold the mask up. The trap didn't need it anymore. "I did," I said. "When?" "The same summer you decided your mother's wedding rings were worth more to a bookie than to her." I kept my voice level, the same tone I would have used to read a survey result off a clipboard, because I had promised myself years ago that if this day ever came, I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me raise my voice over it. I realized that summer that whatever I built with my own hands wasn't safe sitting under a name that would eventually belong to you. So I moved it somewhere you couldn't touch it. I've been renting you the illusion of ownership ever since. Bryant sat very still at the table, visibly understanding in real time that he had wandered into the middle of something considerably larger than a routine appraisal. Kaysen's hands had begun to shake. Not the practiced tremor I'd spent 2 weeks performing for the cameras, but something involuntary and real, the shaking of a man whose entire architecture of self had just been shown to rest on nothing. He looked around the dining room, the crown molding, the marble, the sideboard where his scotch still sat, cracked and dripping, and I watched him understand, second by second, that none of it, not 1 square foot, had ever actually belonged to him. "You cannot sell land you never owned, Kaysen," I said. The room went silent in a way I had never heard a room go silent before. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty house, but something denser, something that seemed to press against the windows and hold the dust mote still in the afternoon light. Bryant didn't move. I didn't move. Kaysen stood frozen beside the sideboard with one hand still resting on the cracked crystal. And for 3 or 4 full seconds, nobody in that dining room breathed. The whole weight of 15 years settling into the space between us like snow finally deciding to fall after holding in the clouds too long. Then Kaysen's glass slipped the rest of the way from his fingers and shattered completely against the marble, and the silence broke apart with it. "Get out," he said to Bryant. Not loudly, but with a controlled violence underneath the words that made the appraiser reach for his portfolio without argument. "We're done here." Bryant didn't need telling twice. He closed his laptop, gathered his things with the brisk efficiency of a man who has decided that whatever family catastrophe he's just witnessed is not worth another billable minute, and let himself out through the front door without a backward glance at either of us. Kaysen and I stood alone in the wreckage of his certainty, the grandfather clock in the hall marking seconds neither of us was counting anymore, and I watched my son's face cycle through every stage of a collapse I had been quietly engineering since he was 20 years old, wondering for the first time in 15 years whether I had built this trap to protect what I loved or simply to finally stop pretending I still trusted him with it. Somewhere in that wreckage, underneath the anger I'd earned every right to feel, I found something smaller and less flattering waiting for me too. The quiet, uncomfortable knowledge that a father who truly believed in his son wouldn't have needed a 15-year contingency plan at all. I had built the trap because some part of me had known even then exactly what he was capable of becoming, and had chosen protection over confrontation every single time it mattered. Kaysen crossed the space between us in 3 strides before I'd finished setting my newspaper aside, and I understood, watching his face, that whatever remained of the sun I'd raised had finished burning off somewhere in the last 30 seconds. He grabbed the front of my coat with both hands and slammed me back against the doorframe, hard enough that the wood cracked against my shoulder blades. I am 68 years old, and I felt every one of those years register the impact at once, a bright, unfamiliar pain radiating out from my spine that no amount of calm arithmetic could entirely talk myself out of noticing. "Undo it," he said, his voice cracking on the second word. "Whatever you did, however you did it, undo it right now." "I can't." I kept my hands loose at my sides, resisting the animal instinct to fight his grip, because fighting would only give him something to push against. "Even if I wanted to, Kaysen. Kramer Land Holdings has a dual signature requirement. My authorization alone doesn't move a single acre." "Then get me the other signature." He tightened his fists in my collar, pulling me half an inch off my heels, close enough that I could smell the fear sweating off him underneath the spilled scotch. "You know how to make this fast. You've always known how to make everything happen exactly when you wanted it to happen." "The other signature belongs to Matthias Hurst." I held his eyes and didn't blink. Didn't raise my voice, didn't give him the fight he was clearly hoping might reset the terms of whatever was happening between us. "And Matthias isn't going to sign anything for you. Not today, not Friday, not ever." He shoved me harder against the frame, and pain lanced bright down through my spine, old bones registering an insult they hadn't absorbed in decades. "You think a lawyer's signature is going to stop men who are going to break my legs by Friday afternoon? I think you should ask yourself why a compliance line never called you back this week," I said. "I think you should ask yourself why Celeste's car left this driveway 3 days ago and hasn't come back. I think if you're honest with yourself for one single moment, you already know the answer. And you're asking me these questions because you'd rather hear it from me than admit you've known it for days." Something in his grip faltered just slightly. The particular hesitation of a man who has been sprinting toward a wall in the dark and has just heard too late the sound of his own feet slowing down. "What did you do?" he said, quieter now. I let the silence stretch a full 3 seconds before I answered him, not for effect, but because some part of me needed those 3 seconds to be entirely certain I was ready to close this particular door forever. "Matthias has been documenting everything since the week you locked that hatch," I said. "The wire fraud, the falsified medical evaluation, Celeste's unauthorized database access, which he reported the same hour it happened. He's been in contact with federal investigators for 11 days. I imagine, given how quiet that compliance line has gone, they're already building the case around you as we speak." Kaysen released my collar like it had gone suddenly molten, staggering back a step, both hands coming up to grip his own hair, and for a moment he looked less like a predator cornered and more like a much younger man discovering all at once that every convenient lie he'd told himself had finally caught up to the same address at the same time. "You reported me," he said. "Your own son. I protected the people you tried to kill." I straightened my coat where his hands had wrinkled it, deliberately unhurried, refusing to let him see how badly my own pulse was hammering underneath the calm. "There's a difference, Kaysen, even if you've spent your whole life too frightened to learn it." He stared at me for a long moment, breathing hard, something raw and childlike surfacing briefly underneath all the desperation, and for one strange second, I thought he might actually cry the way he used to cry as a boy, when a bridge he'd built out of blocks refused to stand, no matter how many times he tried to prop it up. I remembered kneeling beside him on the living room floor at 6 years old, showing him how to widen the base so the weight would distribute evenly. And I remembered thinking even then that he was a boy who wanted the tallest structure without ever wanting to learn the part of the lesson about foundations. The moment didn't last. Whatever softness had surfaced hardened back over, almost immediately replaced by something colder and more calculating, a man doing rapid arithmetic on how much time he had left and what he was willing to do with it. He didn't come at me again. He backed toward the hallway instead, one hand braced against the wall, like the floor had tilted slightly beneath him, his eyes never leaving mine. And I understood, watching him go, that I had just spent the last of whatever patience either of us had left to spend. There would be no more careful silences after this, no more quiet 15-year plans unfolding at their own unhurried pace. I stood in the doorway, rubbing the ache out of my shoulder, listening to his footsteps recede down the hall, and felt underneath the fear I hadn't let him see, something that almost resembled relief. The particular relief of a man who has finally stopped carrying a secret alone. Whatever came next, it was going to come fast, and it was going to come for both of us. I didn't see any of what happened next either, not directly, though I would piece it together in the weeks that followed, from Celeste's own statement to investigators, given under considerably worse circumstances than she could have imagined that afternoon. Kaysen drove straight to the apartment above the fund's downtown office, the unit he'd kept for himself since the marriage started fraying. The one place in 3 counties where nobody thought to look for him, because on paper it belonged to a shell entity 3 layers removed from his own name. He let himself in with a key he'd never given up and went directly for the bedroom closet, tearing a canvas duffel bag down from the top shelf and stuffing it with whatever cash and documents he could grab in under 2 minutes, a passport, a spare laptop, a rubber-banded stack of bills he'd been skimming off the fund's operating account for exactly this kind of emergency. The kind of money a man sets aside when some quiet, dishonest part of him has always suspected the whole structure might eventually collapse. He worked with the efficient, unhurried economy of someone who had clearly rehearsed this exact departure in his head more than once, long before he'd ever needed it to be real. Celeste was already there when he arrived. She'd let herself into the apartment an hour earlier with her own key, unable to sit still in her own place any longer, waiting for federal investigators to call her back. And she was sitting in the dark living room with her phone in her lap when Kaysen burst through the door with his duffel bag and his desperation both fully visible for the first time since she'd met him. She stood the instant she saw the bag. "What is that? Where are you going?" "Not now, Celeste." He didn't slow down. He moved past her toward the safe, hidden behind a framed print in the hallway, punched in the code, and started pulling out banded stacks of euros he'd been quietly converting for months. The kind of foresight a man only bothers with when he's already planned an exit he never told anyone about. "They took my badge," she said, her voice climbing toward something raw and cracked. "Internal Affairs pulled me into a room this morning and took my badge and my clearance and told me I'm looking at federal charges, Kaysen. Do you understand what that means? I did what you asked. I did the thing you begged me to do, crying on your knees, and now I'm the one who's—" "I know what you did." He zipped the duffel closed, cutting her off, not even looking at her while he said it. "I know exactly what you did, and I'm sorry, but I don't have time right now to walk you through how sorry." "You don't have time." She stepped directly into his path, blocking the doorway with her arms spread, the full weight of what she'd sacrificed finally arriving somewhere behind her eyes. "You're going to run. You're actually going to leave me holding this." "You type the commands." His voice went flat and cold in a way I imagine she'd never once heard from him before that moment, all the charm and gratitude stripped entirely away, now that neither one still served a purpose. "You're the one whose login is on the override. That's between you and your own lawyer now." She grabbed the strap of the duffel bag, refusing to let him pass, and for a moment they stood locked in that doorway, 2 people who had built an entire private mythology on top of a lie neither of them had wanted to examine too closely. Kaysen shoved her hard, both hands against her shoulders, and she staggered backward into a glass console table that cracked under her weight and sent her down into the wreckage of it, gasping, one hand pressed to a shoulder that would bruise, a deep, ugly purple by that evening. He didn't apologize. He didn't check whether she was hurt. He crouched only long enough to snatch her car keys from the open purse beside her, calculating even in that moment that his own sports coupe parked one level down in the garage was too recognizable, too easily tracked, while her unremarkable gray sedan would draw no attention at all on the interstate. "You're on your own," he told her, stepping over her legs on his way to the door. "I'd start thinking about a public defender." He left her sitting among the broken glass, the duffel bag over one shoulder, and took the service stairs down to the parking garage rather than risk the lobby cameras by the elevator. He found her sedan exactly where she always parked it, threw the duffel across the passenger seat, and pulled out onto the interstate, merging into the early evening traffic with the particular focused calm of a man who has finally stopped pretending he has any options left except the one he's already chosen. Behind him, in an apartment neither of them would ever share again, Celeste sat alone among broken glass, understanding for the first time with total clarity exactly how completely she had been used, and exactly how alone that understanding was going to leave her for a very long time. She would tell investigators weeks later that the worst part wasn't the shove or the bruise blooming across her shoulder. It was realizing sitting on that floor that he hadn't even bothered to lie to her on his way out the door. He hadn't needed to anymore. "I learned the details of what happened at the airport from the federal complaint itself, weeks later, typed up in the flat procedural language investigators use for even the most desperate hours of a man's life. But I've set it down here the way I've come to picture it, because by then I needed to see it clearly, and because Matthias's tracking data filled in every gap the official report left out." Kaysen abandoned Celeste's gray sedan at the curbside drop-off of North Platte Regional Airport a little after 7 that evening, leaving the engine running and the driver's door hanging open behind him, already moving before the vehicle had fully stopped rolling. He'd booked a charter seat on a small twin-engine flight to Denver under a name that wasn't quite his own, one letter off from Kramer, the kind of amateur alias a desperate man convinces himself will hold up under pressure it was never designed to survive. From Denver, according to the itinerary investigators later recovered from his laptop, he'd planned to catch a connecting international flight before midnight, the first leg of a route that would have put him somewhere without an extradition treaty inside of 30 hours. He had apparently been holding that itinerary in reserve for months, a private escape hatch tucked behind a folder of legitimate travel bookings, the same quiet foresight that had built the offshore cash reserve and rented the apartment nobody knew to look for. A man doesn't plan an exit that carefully, unless some part of him has always known deep down that the structure he was building was never going to hold. He never made it past the security counter. Matthias had installed tracking on every vehicle registered to Kaysen or his known associates months earlier, back when his own audit of the fund's finances first turned up enough irregularity to justify the expense, and Celeste's sedan had been added to that list the same week she moved her boxes into the master bedroom. The moment the car crossed into the airport's parking loop, a quiet alert had already reached both Matthias's monitor and through a channel Matthias had spent considerable effort establishing over the preceding weeks, a federal task force that had been building a case against Kaysen's fund for the better part of 2 months and had simply been waiting for enough evidence to move. Kaysen slapped his falsified passport down on the check-in counter and waited for the automated system to clear him through to the gate. The screen returned a single sharp tone instead, the kind that draws attention rather than deflects it, and the young woman behind the counter glanced at her monitor, then up at him, then reached for a phone mounted beside her register without a word of explanation. He tried to push through the security line anyway, the duffel bag clutched against his chest like it might shield him from what was already moving toward him from both directions. 2 men in dark windbreakers stepped out of the ordinary evening crowd with the seamless, practiced coordination of people who had rehearsed this exact intercept 100 times before, closing on either side of him before he'd covered another 10 feet of terminal floor. Silver badges caught the overhead light. A hand closed around each of his arms, pinning them to his sides, with a grip that made further movement pointless. He went down hard, face against the polished floor, the duffel bag skidding away from him and spilling its contents across the tile in a chaotic scatter of designer clothes and rubber-banded bills that a dozen strangers stopped to stare at before airport security waved them back. One agent planted a knee between his shoulder blades, while the other produced handcuffs and secured his wrists with a sharp final click that investigators would later note almost clinically in their incident report. For a moment, nothing happened at all. The terminal held its breath around him, the ordinary evening bustle of a small regional airport suspended, mid-motion. A mother pulling her child back a step, a gate agent's announcement trailing off unfinished over the intercom before the noise of the world resumed its usual business and swallowed the silence whole. The lead agent recited his rights in the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who has done this exact recitation more times than he could count the words, landing on Kaysen with all the weight of a door closing somewhere far away and permanent. Wire fraud conspiracy, bank fraud, elder financial exploitation. The charges accumulated in a list longer than anything Kaysen could have rehearsed a defense for, even with the 2-hour head start he'd believed right up until the moment the passport scanner rejected him that he still had. He thrashed against the grip, shouting that this was a mistake, that his father had orchestrated the whole thing out of senility and spite, the same lie he'd been rehearsing in his head since the dining room that morning. Nobody in that crowded terminal believed him. A wide, curious circle of travelers had already formed at a careful distance, phones raised, capturing a moment that would end up circulating through the county before the week was out. Here is the part I did not learn from any federal complaint. The part I only understand because I know my son, or knew him, or whatever tense a father is supposed to use for a boy he no longer recognizes, somewhere in that terminal dragged upright by 2 men in dark windbreakers. Kaysen must have looked around for a face that would help him, the way he had looked to me his entire life whenever a structure he'd built collapsed under its own weight. There was no face there for him this time. There was only a crowd of strangers filming a stranger's downfall, and a silence underneath all the noise and the flashing badges that I imagine was louder than anything he had ever heard. The terminal quieted, eventually, the way terminals do once the spectacle is past and the flights resume their ordinary business of leaving on schedule. The 2 agents walked him out through a side exit toward a waiting vehicle, and whatever had been left of the version of my son I used to recognize went with them, folded into the back seat of a government sedan, driven away into an evening that had started for him with a plan to disappear entirely, and ended instead with the one kind of disappearance he'd never once accounted for. The interrogation room was a windowless box of gray concrete and humming fluorescent light, and I know what happened inside it only because Matthias eventually obtained a copy of the recording during discovery months later and sat with me one evening to let me watch it once, start to finish, without commentary. Kaysen sat at the bolted-down metal table, with his wrists still cuffed to a ring welded into its surface, his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained from the terminal floor, and even under fluorescent light and federal custody, he managed to arrange his posture into something that resembled control. He crossed his legs. He tapped his shackled fingers against the table in a rhythm that looked almost bored. When the door finally opened and a detective stepped inside carrying nothing but a single legal pad, Kaysen didn't look worried. He looked like a man preparing to negotiate. He launched into his explanation before the detective had even taken a seat, demanding a call to his attorney while simultaneously, contradictorily, insisting he had nothing to hide and would clear all of this up himself in 5 minutes if anyone would simply listen. He framed the wire transfer at the bank as a misunderstanding regarding legitimate fund operations. He framed the falsified medical evaluation as a well-intentioned effort to help a declining father manage his affairs. He believed that watching him on that recording, that financial fraud was the whole of what he was facing, and he approached it with a specific, misplaced confidence of a man who has talked his way out of smaller messes his entire life and has never once had to reckon with a mess this size. The detective let him talk. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct him, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow at the more obvious fabrications, and Kaysen mistook that patience for an opening, the way he had always mistaken quiet for weakness in every room he'd ever occupied. He began volunteering details nobody had asked for, building out his account with the kind of unnecessary specificity that only a man convinced of his own cleverness supplies. He described the timeline of his wife's disappearance in careful, rehearsed language, a tragic accident at a grain facility, nothing anyone could have prevented. He talked about the moisture readings he claimed to have been checking that night, the faulty wiring he insisted had sparked the blaze, weaving in just enough technical detail about grain dust combustion to sound credible to anyone who hadn't already seen the accelerant burn scarring his wife's forearm. And then explaining why the insurance paperwork had taken so long to process, why he'd needed to move quickly once the claim was finally close to clearing. He said a name he clearly hadn't planned to say. "Celeste helped me get the documentation together," he said, waving a shackled hand like the detail was too minor to matter. "She works in oversight. She knew the right forms. She was just trying to help me get through a horrible time faster than the bureaucracy usually allows." The detective's pen paused for the first time since he'd sat down. "Celeste Rosario," he said, not quite a question. "Yes." Kaysen didn't catch the shift in the room, the particular stillness that settles over an investigator who has just been handed something he didn't have to ask for. "She's been a tremendous support. None of this is her fault. She just helped me with the paperwork." He kept talking oblivious, elaborating on Celeste's role in a way that transformed her from an unnamed, unauthorized override on a federal database into a named co-conspirator with a documented motive, a documented relationship, and now a documented admission from the one person who had the least reason on earth to protect her. He was trying to minimize his own exposure and had instead handed investigators the exact connective tissue they needed to build a wire fraud and conspiracy case that would follow Celeste for the rest of her career, whether or not she'd ever fully understood what she was helping him accomplish. The detective made a small notation on his legal pad, unhurried, and let Kaysen continue burying himself for another 20 uninterrupted minutes describing the exact position of the ventilation hatch, the specific wiring panel he blamed for the spark, details growing more elaborate and more precise the longer nobody challenged him. Every fabricated detail was a felony charge waiting to be filed. Every unnecessary elaboration was another nail. Kaysen believed he was demonstrating his innocence through sheer volume of detail. He was, in fact, constructing the state's entire perjury case against himself, one confident sentence at a time, while a hidden camera in the corner of the ceiling recorded every syllable for a jury that hadn't been selected yet. When he finally finished, the detective thanked him, closed his legal pad, and told him with no particular emphasis that his statement had been extremely helpful. Kaysen smiled. He believed right up until the moment the door closed behind the detective that he had won. Watching that recording months later, sitting beside Matthias in his quiet downtown office, I found myself unable to feel the satisfaction I'd expected. I had spent 15 years believing my son's greatest flaw was greed. Watching him talk himself into a federal indictment out of nothing but vanity and the old familiar need to be the smartest man in any room he occupied, I understood it had never been greed at all. Greed at least wants something specific enough to stop wanting once it has it. What I watched on that recording was a man who couldn't stop explaining himself, even when silence was the only thing left that might have saved him. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 31 days after I'd watched my daughter-in-law disappear into the dark behind a roadside diner, and I sat in the front row of the gallery in my one good suit, with Matthias beside me, his leather briefcase resting on his knees, his expression arranged into the same careful neutrality he brought to every difficult negotiation. The courtroom filled slowly around us reporters and county residents and a scattering of investors who'd trusted their retirement savings to a fund that no longer existed in any recoverable form, all of them murmuring in the low, expectant register of people who'd read enough headlines to think they already knew how this story ended. They didn't. Not yet. Hannah had spent the last several weeks in a secure location Matthias had arranged, resting with Emmett, working with prosecutors on a testimony strategy nobody in that gallery had the slightest idea was coming. A side door opened and a bailiff led Kaysen into the room in a bright orange county jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles chained together in a way that made his once confident stride into a shuffling, undignified scrape against the floorboards. He'd lost weight in a month. The bruised arrogance he'd worn like armor through every confrontation I'd had with him had faded into something grayer. though as he scanned the gallery and found my face, I watched a flicker of the old defiance surface again. Quick and brittle. The judge entered, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation county attorneys spoke of carefully, and called the room to order with a single crack of her gavel. The prosecutor rose first, a tall man who wasted no time on theatrics and methodically laid out the financial timeline for the court. He walked the room through the fund's collapsing books, the hard money loans, the falsified medical evaluation, the wire fraud attempt at the bank, projecting bank statements and loan records onto a screen mounted against the far wall, until the sheer, accumulated weight of Cassen's desperation sat undeniable in front of everyone in the room. He detailed the reversion clause buried in Hannah's family trust, the clause that would have handed her land parcel directly to Cassen as surviving spouse had she died without a living heir, and the timeline connecting Cassen's mounting debts directly to the exact week his wife discovered the fraud in his books and vanished into a burning grain bin. I had lived inside every one of those numbers for weeks by then, had done the arithmetic myself in a cold utility room by flashlight, and still felt something clench in my chest hearing it recited aloud in a room full of strangers, made suddenly publicly real in a way that no amount of private calculation had prepared me for. Cassen sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw working, a muscle in his cheek twitching each time the prosecutor advanced to the next damning exhibit. His attorney scribbled notes with visible urgency, but the financial evidence alone painted a portrait so complete that I watched several jurors' faces, though there was no jury yet. Only the judge and a gallery full of future jurors reading the county paper settle into the particular stillness of people who have already made up their minds. The defense attorney rose the moment the prosecutor returned to his seat, a sharp, expensive-looking man who buttoned his jacket with the theatrical confidence of someone who has built an entire career on exploiting the one gap the state's case couldn't close. He didn't dispute the financial ruin. He didn't contest the falsified medical evaluation or the fraudulent wire transfer. He conceded all of it almost breezily, before pivoting directly to the only argument he apparently believed could still save his client. The state has built an elaborate narrative, he said, addressing the judge directly, based entirely on bank statements and unfortunate timing. What the state has not produced in 31 days of investigation is a body. He let the words settle before continuing. No remains were recovered from the grain facility. No medical examiner has determined a cause of death, because no death has been forensically established at all. The state is asking this court to detain a grieving widower on the theory of a murder for which they cannot produce a single physical shred of proof that a murder actually occurred. He requested the immediate dismissal of any language implying homicide, and asked that his client be released on bail to prepare a defense against the remaining financial charges from a location other than a county holding cell. I watched Cassen's shoulders loosen slightly at the defense table, the first real relief I'd seen cross his face since the terminal floor, and understood exactly what he believed was happening. He believed the ocean of financial evidence had obscured the one gap that mattered. He believed the absence of a body was a wall nobody could climb, and I could see him already rehearsing behind his eyes the version of the next 6 months where he walked out of that courtroom to fight only paperwork, only numbers. Nothing that could ever put him back in front of a jury on a charge he actually understood the weight of. The prosecutor stood again, unhurried, and buttoned his own jacket with a calm that told me before he'd said a single word that he'd been waiting for precisely this argument. "Your Honor," he said, "the state agrees there is no body." He turned not toward the judge, but toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. "We don't need one. The state is prepared to call its primary witness." The entire gallery turned as one toward the back of the room, and I felt Matthias's hand find my forearm, steady and brief, the only outward acknowledgement either of us allowed ourselves of what was about to happen. The heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom swung outward with a resounding, deliberate thud, and every ordinary sound in that room, the murmur of the gallery, the shuffle of the reporters' notepads, the faint hum of the overhead lights, seemed to drop away all at once, replaced by a silence so total I could hear my own pulse working against my collar. Hannah stepped across the threshold. She was not the fragile, terrified, heavily pregnant woman Kaysen had dragged onto whatever version of the truth he'd told himself that night in the grain bin. She wore a sharply tailored navy suit that had nothing in common with the stained pink diner uniform I'd first seen her in, her hair pulled back clean from a face pale but utterly composed. Her features set with the particular stillness of a woman who has rehearsed this exact walk in her mind 100 times and is now simply executing it. She did not look down. She did not shrink beneath the weight of every eye in that gallery swinging toward her at once. She walked down the center aisle with a slow, measured stride, the sharp click of her heels against the hard wood counting down the seconds like a metronome set to the exact tempo of my son's unraveling. Somewhere behind me, a reporter's chair creaked as its occupant leaned forward, and a woman 2 rows back whispered something urgent to the person beside her that I couldn't make out over the sound of my own pulse. I watched her pass the row where I sat, and caught for just a fraction of a second the glint of the small silver pocket watch she still carried clipped inside her jacket, the same one she'd used a decade of her professional life to time a heifer's labored breathing. The same one she'd worn the night she pulled herself out of a burning grain bin and swam through smoke toward a narrow tunnel in the dark. It was such a small thing. I don't know why it was the detail that undid me most, watching her walk toward the witness stand, but it was. Emmett was not yet a month old, safe in a secure nursery 2 floors above us, with a private nurse Matthias had personally vetted, and some part of me understood watching his mother's steady stride that she had left him there this morning, trusting nothing but her own resolve to carry her back to him by evening. The physical transformation alone would have been enough to shatter Kaysen's entire defense. He had spent 31 days building a narrative of a grieving, victimized husband, weaponizing her supposed fragility, her supposed absence, the supposed tragedy of a body the state could never produce. The woman walking down that aisle obliterated the narrative simply by existing, by breathing, by being visibly and undeniably alive, in a navy suit under fluorescent courtroom light. She reached the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court and stopped. She did not look at the judge. She did not look at the prosecutor or at her own attorney's careful nod of acknowledgement from the front row. She turned her head slow and deliberate and found Kaysen at the defense table. I watched my son's reaction happen in stages, each one arriving a half-second behind the last, like a structure failing, floor by floor. First the confusion, his mind visibly refusing the visual information his eyes were sending it. Then the recognition, sudden and total, draining every trace of color from his face at once. Then something beyond either of those, something closer to the raw animal terror of a man watching a physical law of the universe break directly in front of him. The dead standing upright, wearing a navy suit, looking directly at the man who had killed her. He had spent 31 days in a county jumpsuit rehearsing every possible version of a future that assumed her silence was permanent. Watching him now, I understood he had never once, not for a single hour in that cell, allowed himself to imagine this exact moment as a possibility worth preparing for. His mouth opened. No sound came out of it. His hands still chained to the table jerked once against the restraints, an involuntary flinch with nowhere to go. The defense attorney beside him had gone equally rigid, his pen frozen mid-motion above his legal pad, visibly recalculating an entire strategy that had just collapsed in real time in front of a packed gallery. Hannah raised her right hand slow and deliberate and pointed one steady finger directly at him. The courtroom held its breath around that gesture. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The silence stretched 3 full seconds, then 4, then 5, dense enough that I could hear the old radiator along the far wall ticking as it cooled, dense enough that the reporter 2 rows behind me forgot for that stretch of time to write anything down at all. It was the kind of silence I imagine only arrives once or twice in a courtroom's entire history. The sound of an entire room's understanding of reality rearranging itself all at once, and I found I could not have spoken into it myself even if I'd wanted to. Kaysen sat frozen in his chair, with his own hollowed, disbelieving eyes locked on the finger aimed at his chest, and I understood, watching him, that whatever remained of the man I had raised had just witnessed the exact moment his final lie ran out of road. Then the judge's gavel cracked once against its sound block, restoring the ordinary noise of the world, and the bailiff moved to escort Hannah the rest of the way to the witness stand. The bailiff swore Hannah in, and she took her seat at the witness stand with the same composed stillness she'd carried down the center aisle, adjusting the microphone to her height with a steady hand before she began. I watched her scan the gallery once briefly, and understood she was looking for Emmett's nurse, among the faces, confirming without needing to ask that someone trustworthy had eyes on her son while she did this. She did not raise her voice once during the 20 minutes that followed. She didn't need to. She described the night in the grain bin in clinical, exacting detail, the moisture readings Kaysen had asked her to check, the bolt sliding shut on the exterior hatch before she'd smelled the first trace of smoke, the accelerant burn that still scarred her forearm in a pattern no accidental fire could have produced. She described crawling through a decades-old auger tunnel she'd only known about from routine veterinary visits to the property, swimming through smoke and darkness on nothing but the memory of a tenant's offhand mention of an access panel. She described the 11 months that followed, the shelters, the false names, the specific loneliness of carrying a child while trusting almost no one with the truth of who its father was. The defense attorney's cross-examination, when it finally came, was brief and visibly desperate. He asked why she hadn't gone to the authorities immediately upon reaching safety. He suggested, without much conviction, that her account might be motivated by a financial dispute rather than an honest recollection of events. Hannah answered each question without flinching, without raising her voice, dismantling each suggestion with the same patient precision she'd once used to audit a fraudulent balance sheet. And by the time she finished, the attorney had stopped asking questions that gave her room to answer them so completely. The prosecutor rose next and called me to the stand. I walked to the witness box with a steadier gait than I'd allowed myself in weeks, done pretending to knead it slow, and took the oath with a voice that carried clean across the room. I laid out methodically the 15 years of Kramer land holdings, the timeline of the deed transfer, the falsified medical evaluation Dr. Moran had produced for a fee. I explained the dual signature structure that had frozen Kaysen's attempts to liquidate the trust, and the honeypot account that had flagged his attempted wire transfer the moment he'd tried to breach it. Then the prosecutor asked me to describe the events of the afternoon Dr. Moran had come to the house, and I told the court about the folded white envelope, the cash inside it, the casual, practiced way a bribe had changed hands in my own kitchen while I sat, pretending not to understand what I was watching. "Mr. Kramer," the prosecutor said, "is there any independent record of that transaction?" "There is." I kept my voice level. Mr. Hurst arranged for a legally authorized recording device to be placed in the house several weeks earlier as part of a documented elder financial abuse investigation. It captured the entire exchange. The prosecutor requested permission to enter the recording into evidence, and the judge granted it with a single nod. He connected a small device to the courtroom's audio system, and Kaysen's own voice filled the room a moment later. Crisp and unmistakable, arranging the specifics of a $50,000 bribe with a doctor willing to falsify a diagnosis in exchange for it. The recording ran for 90 seconds. Nobody in that gallery moved or spoke while it played. I watched Kaysen's face empty out entirely. Watched him understand, syllable by syllable, that the last shred of ambiguity his attorney might have argued around had just evaporated in his own recorded voice. The defense attorney did not cross-examine me. He sat with his head bowed slightly over his legal pad, and I understood, watching him, that he had already begun composing whatever version of a plea negotiation he was going to recommend to his client before the day was finished. The judge did not take long to deliberate. She removed her reading glasses, folded her hands on the bench, and addressed the courtroom directly, her voice carrying the particular flat authority of someone who has heard more than enough to make a decision she considers obvious. "Given the testimony presented today," she said, including direct witness identification, independently corroborated financial fraud, and recorded evidence of witness and evaluator tampering. This court finds the defendant an extreme flight risk and an active danger to his family. The motion for bail is denied. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. For a moment afterward, nothing in that courtroom moved at all. The silence that followed the gavel's crack was different from the one Hannah's entrance had produced, denser somehow, heavier, the particular quiet of a room absorbing an ending rather than a beginning. I sat very still in my seat and let it settle over me without reaching for any feeling in particular, watching two bailiffs move to either side of Kaysen's chair. Kaysen lunged upright the instant the spell broke, chains rattling violently against the table, and swept his cuffed hands across the surface in front of him, sending a water pitcher and a stack of legal binders crashing to the floor. He screamed something incoherent at his own attorney, at the judge, at the ceiling itself. 3 federal marshals converging on him within seconds and forcing him face down into the scattered papers, a knee pressed firm between his shoulder blades. They dragged him toward the side door, still shouting, his voice cracking apart into something that no longer resembled the confident, controlled register he'd used against me on the porch a month earlier. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, and the chaotic sound of his struggle faded into the ordinary hum of a courtroom returning to its business. And I sat beside Matthias with my hands folded in my lap, feeling for the first time in 31 days the particular exhaustion of a man who has finally stopped needing to hold anything up. Hannah found my eyes across the well of the court before the bailiff led her back through the gate, and neither of us said anything at all. There wasn't a word built yet in any language I knew for what it felt like to watch justice arrive exactly on schedule and discover it tasted nothing like the victory I'd spent 15 years quietly rehearsing. Matthias called 2 days after the hearing, his voice carrying the same flat procedural calm he used for every update, good or bad. Celeste had been taken into custody that morning, he told me, arrested outside the county prosecutor's office where she'd gone, apparently, to try to negotiate some kind of voluntary cooperation agreement before the wire fraud charges caught up with her formally. She hadn't resisted. The agents who took her described her in their report as composed and almost relieved, a woman who had spent weeks anticipating an ending and had simply been waiting for it to finally arrive. I felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected from that news. I thought of her sitting alone among broken glass in an apartment she'd never share with Kaysen again, understanding for the first time exactly how completely she'd been used. And I found I couldn't locate any triumph in the picture of her being led away in handcuffs to answer for a crime she'd committed out of love for a man who had never once loved her back the way she'd needed him to. She would spend the coming months, I imagined, learning the same lesson I had spent 15 years learning far too slowly myself, that loving someone badly enough to protect them from consequences is not the same thing as loving them well. Matthias mentioned almost as an afterthought that her attorney was already exploring a cooperation deal in exchange for testimony against Kaysen's fund, and some part of me hoped, without quite being able to say why, that it would go easier on her than the system usually allowed. I drove home from that phone call and stood for a long while in the driveway looking at the house the way I imagined Bryant must have looked at his laptop screen, seeing something suddenly unfamiliar in a structure I'd known my entire adult life. The front door still hung slightly crooked on its hinges from the night the lenders had come through it. The living room beyond the windows still held the wreckage of shattered vases and cracked side tables nobody had touched since. I had spent 15 years quietly protecting this house from my son's worst instincts, and it had still ended up looking like a battlefield. I called a restoration crew out of North Platte that afternoon, the kind of outfit that specialized in estate cleanouts after a death or a foreclosure, and told the foreman I wanted the interior gutted down to the studs if that's what it took to remove every trace of the last year. He didn't ask questions. Men in his line of work rarely do. They arrived within 2 hours in a convoy of unmarked vans, a crew of a dozen moving through the house with the brisk, wordless efficiency of people who had done this exact kind of work before and understood without needing it explained that speed mattered more than sentiment. They hauled the shattered vases and the broken side tables out to industrial dumpsters parked along the drive. They tore down the silk curtains Cassen's mother had chosen decades earlier, curtains I'd never had the heart to replace even after she passed, and I watched them go without feeling anything close to the grief I might once have predicted. Somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, I realized I could no longer remember the last time I'd actually looked at those curtains, rather than simply looking past them. I directed a separate team to Cason's former bedroom suite, myself, standing in the doorway, while they emptied his closet into heavy black contractor bags, the tailored suits, the Italian shoes, the cufflinks he'd bought to look like a man who'd earned them. Every item disappeared into plastic and out to the waiting trucks, and by the middle of the afternoon, the room held nothing but bare walls and the pale rectangular ghosts on the carpet where furniture had once stood. The crew scrubbed the hardwood floors with industrial solvent and washed down every window until the glass threw clean, unfiltered light across rooms that had felt dim and airless for longer than I'd consciously noticed. The heavy mahogany dining table where Cason had once narrated the house's value to Jeffrey Bryant like a man reciting a resume went out on a flatbed by early evening, replaced the following morning by a simple oak table I'd ordered from a catalog without much thought beyond wanting something that had never held a single one of my son's lies. By the time the last van pulled out of the driveway, the house felt lighter than I remembered it feeling in years, not simply cleaner, but somehow more honest, as though the physical clutter of Cason's ambitions had been the only thing keeping the rooms from finally telling the truth about what they actually were. I walked through the empty hallways once alone, listening to my own footsteps echo off bare walls, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight since a stained pink uniform first caught the light in a roadside diner 33 days earlier. The estate was purged. What came next was going to require building something new inside it, rather than simply excavating what had rotted. Matthias arrived at the house a week later with a thick leather portfolio and Hannah beside him. Emmett secured against her chest in a wrap she'd learned to tie one-handed sometime in the last month, and we sat together around the new oak table for the first meeting of what I intended to be many. He spread the finalized trust documents across the table, transferring full control of Kramer Land Holdings from my name to Hannah's, structured with the same dual-signature architecture that had protected it from Cason for 15 years, now protecting it for her son instead. She read through the language with the same sharp, unhurried attention she'd once turned on Cason's fraudulent balance sheets, asking precise questions about liability and succession that told me more clearly than any speech could have that the estate was landing in exactly the right hands. She signed her name at the bottom of the final page with a steady stroke, and the transfer was complete. I watched her set down the pen and look at Emmett sleeping against her chest, and understood that whatever legacy I'd spent 40 years building had finally found the person it was always meant to belong to. I drove to the federal detention facility 3 days after that signing alone, because some conversations a man owes only to himself to finish. The visitation room was a narrow concrete box divided by reinforced glass, and I sat in the hard plastic chair on my side of it for several minutes before a guard led Cason in. He had aged in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar, his cheeks hollowed, his once immaculate haircut grown out shaggy and uneven, the orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that had shed weight it couldn't afford to lose. He picked up the black telephone receiver on his side of the glass with a shaking hand, and I lifted my own. He didn't ask about the estate or the trial date or Hannah. He asked about my father's compass, the one that had been broken on the lawn the night he'd first thrown my tools outside, and whether I'd ever managed to get the glass replaced. It was such a small, strange question that I found myself answering it honestly before I understood why he'd asked it at all. "I have it in my coat pocket," I said. "I never did fix the glass." He nodded slowly, and something shifted in his face. some final wall coming down that I hadn't seen him drop even in the courtroom. "Mom told me about the trust," he said, "before she died. I was 17 and she was already sick. And she said something once about land that was set aside for the future, and I didn't understand what she meant. And I didn't ask her to explain it because I was 17 and I thought I had time to ask later." His voice cracked on the word later. "I forgot about it completely. Or I made myself forget it because remembering it meant admitting I'd have to build something myself eventually instead of just waiting to inherit whatever was already there." I sat with that confession for a long moment, understanding exactly what it cost him to offer it, and exactly how little it changed. A boy who ignores his dying mother's warning because facing it feels harder than avoiding it is still eventually a man who chooses the hatch and the accelerant when avoidance stops being enough. Explanation was not the same thing as absolution, and I had learned over the last 43 days precisely how to hold both truths at once without letting either one soften the other. "I need you to help me hire real counsel," he said, the confession pivoting predictably toward its actual purpose. "A public defender can't fight federal charges like these. You still have access to funds through the trust, even if it's Hannah's now. If you asked her—" "I'm not going to ask her that." I kept my voice level, the same tone I'd used across a kitchen table and a dining room and a hospital clipboard, the tone I had spent 30 years perfecting for moments that required absolute steadiness. "You'll have a public defender, and you'll face what you did, and I won't spend another dollar softening the landing for you." His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to cry over collapsing block towers before something colder replaced it. Something that finally seemed to understand there was no more rope left to throw him. I didn't wait for him to respond. I set the receiver back onto its cradle gently, without slamming it, and stood from the plastic chair. I didn't offer a final word or a parting glance through the glass. I turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit door, and behind me I could hear him pressing his palm flat against the reinforced glass, though I didn't turn to see it. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long while afterward, the engine off, my hand resting on the cracked leather of my coat pocket, where my father's broken compass had lived for over a month now. I took the old appraisal notebook out of the glove compartment, the one I'd carried into a roadside diner 43 days earlier, and opened it to the page where I'd once jotted parcel numbers in my own private shorthand. Near the back, tucked between two ordinary entries, I found the line I'd written the week Kaysen was born, his birth date and weight recorded in the same careful hand I used for everything that mattered enough to remember. I looked at it for a long moment. I did not tear the page out. I drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat beside me, carrying in the same worn leather cover both the ledger of everything I had built and the one page I still couldn't bring myself to erase. The old appraisal notebook sits open on the kitchen table, these days not in my coat pocket anymore. Hannah's handwriting fills the newer pages now, parcel numbers and soil grades, in a hand steadier than mine ever was. My own faded shorthand still visible on the pages behind hers. Morning light comes through windows nobody bothered to curtain. Somewhere, out past the porch, a small boy is laughing at something only he finds funny, and nobody rushes to quiet him. I spent 15 years believing that love meant standing quietly between the people I cared for and the consequences of their own choices, absorbing every blow so they'd never have to feel the weight of it themselves. I understand now that this was never protection. It was postponement dressed up as devotion, and every year I spent postponing was a year I spent teaching my son that consequences were something other people managed for him. Real love, it turns out, sometimes looks like stepping back and letting the truth land exactly where it was always going to land. I don't know if I'll ever stop keeping that page with his birthday written on it. I don't know if a father is supposed to. What I know is that honor was never mine to hand him. It was always his to build one honest choice at a time, and no amount of quiet architecture I constructed on his behalf could have done that work for him. There were nights I doubted whether silence was strength or simply fear wearing a patient face. God knows I asked myself that question more times than I ever asked anyone else. God knows I didn't always trust the answer. And God knows the family sitting around my table now was worth every uncertain year it took me to find it. So here's the question I'll leave you with, the one I still turn over some mornings with my coffee. If you discovered the people closest to you were capable of the very worst thing you could imagine, would you protect them in silence the way I did for 15 years? Or would you have found the courage to confront it the first time you saw the crack in the foundation? Tell me in the comments where you'd land. I suspect the answer isn't as simple as any of us want it to be. And if this story found something true in you, stay a while longer.